Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the November 2017 Soils Network of Knowledge webinar. Let's just go to introducing Carol. Carol has worked for New South Wales DPI for some 25 years as a technical officer and a district agronomist, and is now an educational officer at our Tokyo College. During this time, she's worked in a whole range of different areas, and she'll tell you about that. She's co-author of the very popular books Grasses of Coastal New South Wales and Legumes and Herbs of Coastal New South Wales, and has a wealth of experience and knowledge that informs what she's talking about today, which is using landscapes to help inform you about soils. So thank you to Carol.
So this is my talk on reading the landscape, not just your soil test. And I started out in the department as a young naive agronomist, first as a technical officer in research at Tamworth and then in the Marywar area, and moved to the mid-north coast. And on this side, here's Abby, if you haven't met her, but listening to me, and on the mid-north coast and north coast, you've got to be able to prepare to run your field days in any weather. And but 4 years or so ago, I moved to Tokyo College, and I became an education officer there. At Tokyo, it's part of the Department of Primary Industries, but we run youth education, which I'm part of, but also have adult education through short courses. Some of you may have been to Tokyo to do a course. And here's me with my students out in one of our paddocks. We've got over 2,000 hectares, and I prefer the open learning to the classroom. But my average age of the people I train has gone down 35 years, and I've definitely aged through the process. So an overview today is that this talk is just like a snapshot of a course that we used to run called Landscan, and the DAs used to run, and Paddock plants, which is still run by Tokyo. So soil tests are just a tool. They tell you the chemistry of the top 10 centimetres. That's, of course, if that's where you took them. That's where most of them are taken these days. But it does not tell you the physical or biological properties of your soil. So your landscape can tell you so much more that informs what your soil test is telling you. It can be the geology, the soil depth and slope, and indicator plants. I'm going to talk in depth more about all of these. But economic return is also very important. What is growing or what you want to grow will depend on how you interpret a soil test. So when I'm running a field day with farmers or with my students, I go to a paddock with a view, and I ask them, what's the soil made up of? If it's made on site, is there any geology around that's going to help us, give us an idea about the soil? But what if the soils come from somewhere else? And of course, where we're standing here is a sandstone ridge, and so we've got a very sandy soil there with a low CEC. All this soil down here is all alluvial soil. It's come from somewhere else, and a lot of people don't take that into account. Now, if we compare rivers, so where the soil comes from, if we compare the Macleay Valley up near Kempsey, it comes from the granite tablelands, granite soils of the tablelands. The soils down there are sands and silt. Compare that to Bellingen Valley, which isn't far away, and all the erosion that's made the alluvial soils there has all come from the rich red soils of Dorrigo Plateau. It's a much more fertile valley. But the speed of the floods also can affect what sort of soil's there, because of course the speed that the river floods out of the landscape depends on what particle of soil they drop, whether it's going to be a sand or a silt or a clay that it drops. So down near the mouth of the river where the waters flood slowly, you're more likely to get silts and clays. But up the river, you're more likely to get sands because the river's still moving fairly fast. So here I also ask them, which soil is the deepest? Well, in our landscape here, it's these alluvial soils down here, which also makes them the most productive. But unlike most people say, over here, that's going to be pretty productive, but that area there floods too much, that area on the right, whereas this area over here floods a lot less. So it's the most productive land on the farm, this sort of property. So if we look at the landscape telling us, these sandstone cliffs are not far from a place called Sandy Hollow. You can guess what sort of soil is there. Good wine comes from that area too. If you've got limestone caves, and this is a limestone cave, this picture here, if you've got limestone caves, you quite often get this really pinky purpley soil. This is from the limestone belt that's in the Macleay Valley on the mid-north coast. And you know you're going through limestone areas because there can be limestone rocks in these paddocks, but this purple soil is a bit of a giveaway. Then we've got the basalt soils. So we've got the typical basalt columns, or it might be craters, it might be volcanic plugs. And around where I've been working, they lead to black soils around Marywall inland or on the red soils of the coastal plateaus. So that all that geology is telling us something about the soils that's going to be there. Unfortunately for the farmers in this region, coal is also associated with these soils. But soil depth is also really important. It's well, basically where the roots can explore. And so if we're just measuring in our soil test this top 10 centimetres, it's not telling us about what's going down here. But you don't necessarily have to dig a pit like this to have a look. You can have a look at a natural bit of erosion like that, telling you, well, that particular bit of alluvial soil is very deep. Unfortunately, they're also losing it to the river. This particular soil, pretty shallow, very tiny bit of topsoil over a sodic layer over rock. So that's at Wollawarren, again in the Macleay River and Macleay River Valley. So then we can look at our other factors. I wasn't going to go into aspect very much, but if you've got one sort of soil type, but you've got two aspects in a paddock, then one aspect is likely to be better than other. If you think about it, we site our houses on to face north if we've got a choice, because the westerly side is so hot. And if the west side is hot, evaporates more, you're going to have more challenge for your plants. So that can affect how you interpret your soil test, where the aspect is. Of course, if you're on the tablelands, you might want to be warmer. The microclimate might help you. Then we've got animal behaviour. So animals like to camp. They like to sit in certain areas. They move nutrients around in your paddock. I've often had a farmer say to me, I want my paddock to look like that ridgeline where all the kikuyu is growing. Well, that's growing there because that's where all the manure's dropped. The higher quality soil is there because of all that history of manure build-up. And it's just not possible to do it in the whole paddock for an economic return. Then we get to slope. Now, slope is all about how much moisture can infiltrate into the soil. So if we look at it with these rather simplistic diagrams, if your slope is flat, when the rain comes, it pools here and is able to infiltrate over time. And that's whether the infiltrate is good or poor. Whereas if the rain falls on a slope, some will infiltrate, but a lot will just run off. And again, how much of each will depend on the intensity of the rain, but how good your infiltration rate is. There's a really easy way to test your infiltration rate with a bit of poly pipe that you put in the ground and put water in. And I'm going to give a plug here for the Soil Health Card, which was developed up on the north coast. Abby was part of that project. It's a really good card with some very simple field tests that farmers can do and you can do yourself, and simple tools. We talk about our infiltrometer. Well, it's just a piece of poly pipe. We also got a piece of wire to see where the compaction layer is. So it's a really good way to inform your soil tests just from some of the physical properties and biological properties too. Okay, well that brings me to indicator plants. Now, indicator plants can tell you a lot about your landscape, but I'm going to put some riders on this. You've already heard me talking coastal. That's where a lot of my experience is, on the coast. We have a list of over 40 plants that have indicator factors. I'm just going to give you a few, don't worry. Now with so in the book, The Grasses of Coastal New South Wales, there's actually a section where it talks about the grass where it says this might be an indicator of this condition. Now, some things are an indicator of one condition on the coast and an indicator of another condition inland. Couch, for instance, is a very, very tough grass, and it can be an indicator of salinity on the livable plains, and it can be an indicator of compaction, salinity, poor fertility, over ploughing, all these things on the coast. So it's a good thing to go and ask your local land managers if you're not familiar with what the indicators are, and say, what are the indicators? What does different things tell you about the landscape? So apart from the grasses of coastal New South Wales, Harry, my partner in crime there, has written grasses of the slopes and plains. There's also grasses of the tablelands as well. So if anybody's got those, unfortunately there's only one legume book at the moment. So let's look at a few examples here. Now the pin rush, the Juncus species, they are just a sign of continuous or periodic waterlogging. You'll see them often in creek lines, but you can also see them mid-slope if there's a bit of a soak area on the mid-slope. Now Bugalia tussock, those of you from the south coast would be familiar with this guy. It's very common on some of the properties there, but it's usually an indicator of poor ground competition, but the periodic moist to waterlogged soils. Often you'll find a fairly good topsoil, maybe a silt, a loam over a heavier clay, and that infiltration going into the heavy clay is held up, so it gets a waterlogged zone between the interfaces, and that gives you perfect Bugalia tussock country. And it's not a grass, so a lot of farmers can't understand why their stock aren't eating it. It's not a grass, it's not palatable. And keeping on the same theme, swamp foxtail, the name gives it away, doesn't it? Swamp foxtail. And I've got, it's formerly Pennisetum, it's changed its name. It's a sign of poorly drained, moist to wet, usually heavy soils. So those of you up on the north coast would recognise these from the heavy black soil areas up there. If you happen to be with a farmer and you're driving across their property and you see a bit of swamp foxtail, suggest they don't drive into it if it's been wet recently. I've been bogged up to the axles in one of these areas. Then we've got some of the tree indicators. There's quite a few, but this one is very prevalent around here, and that's spotted gum. It's another one that's changed its name from. But it's an indicator of shallow soils. For those of you not familiar, this tree looks like someone's attacked it with a ball peen hammer, and so it's got dents all over it. That tree that we saw in the early photo with the students had a very shallow root system. That was a spotted gum, and when the storms hit, they go over, but they can grow in that really challenging soils. Now this one is a close-up of sorrel. It's a sign of poorly competitive pastures, but that's mostly due to acid, low fertility and sandy soils. And I see that and I immediately go, we've got probably got an acidity problem. Another one that's very common on the coast is whiskey grass. It's a sign of low fertility, especially phosphorus, but it's also a sign of low grazing pressure. If you've got high grazing pressure, you'll have a different grass species there. But again, without doing a soil test, I can look at the paddock on the farm and just go, you've got a phosphorus issue. If you want to change this, don't spray it, put some fertiliser out. So plants can also indicate problems with roots and their top growth. Now this is a canola plant, that flat root system, which means it's a tap-rooted plant. No taproot really evident there. It should be going down at least 3/4 of a metre. That's a sign of compaction. Now the other sign, you can see the flowers just vaguely out of focus in the background. Canola is quite bright yellow colour, but if the flowers are pale yellow, more like mustard weed, then you know you've got a sulphur deficiency in your soil. So plants can tell you quite a bit about what's going on below. And here we are with the compaction. The problem, of course, with the compaction layer is the access of the plant's roots to both moisture and nutrients. Now in this case that says to 5 centimetres, but if that compaction is down here at 10 centimetres, then your soil test can be indicating all sorts of good things, but you're not getting the performance. And it's because the roots aren't going to depth. So how do we put this all together and so that we aren't just stumbling around in the dark? Well, these soil tests all come from a research trial that we did in the Macleay Valley, so they're all real figures. The soil was sampled 0 to 10. We also have one from 10 to 20, but I haven't got that data here. And it also, part of the trial, looked at what was growing in there, and we also looked at farmer history of the paddocks. But I've just selected a few of these for you to talk about. So first of all here, we've got pH, calcium chloride pH. It's 4.9, it's a bit acid. And I should say for anyone who's from inland, 4.9 for us, 5 and above, 5 to 5.5 is the area that is our benchmark on the coast. And that's something else. These benchmarks are from the north coast and they're for beef cattle. And there are different benchmarks for different crops, different situations. And you need to know, again, the benchmarks for your own area. So here we are. So as soon as I look at the pH and as soon as I see acidity, I check out the aluminium saturation. So it's 4.9. Above, Clover can cope with 10, but lucerne is much more sensitive and it can only cope with 5 as a seedling. So it certainly would be an issue for seedling lucerne. When it's an adult, it might be okay. And here too, organic carbon 2.7 is slightly low. Again, on the coast, we're looking for an organic carbon above 3 in our soils, and easily achievable in our pastures. Everything else here is pretty good. We've got the sulfate sulfur is, which is 15. We're looking for above 8. The coal well is really high. The potassium's good. The cation exchange capacity of 11.9 is what we'd expect in a loam soil, and the other factors are all looking pretty good. So in a soil test like that, first look at the soil test, we would say just add lime. So what's growing in this paddock? Well, at the moment, it's productive lucerne and white clover flat. If I saw that soil test and I saw this part of the landscape, I would say I would certainly be thinking of adding lime. We're not going to get an immediate economic return because it's not that low yet, but lime, because it works so slowly, is something to get in ahead of the game. But that's not all. That's because I've seen this paddock and now I know. But what happens if that same paddock was full of giant Parramatta grass? Well, then it's a total game changer, because giant Parramatta grass is a weed. It doesn't respond to lime. It's not there because of the pH. It's there because it's invaded and the pasture was weak for some other reason. It might have been a flood. So in this case, I'd say, well, don't worry about the lime yet. You've got to have a program for your giant Parramatta grass and how you're going to control it, and get a species in there that's going to give you an economic return to making any changes to your soil. Well, actually an economic return, because that soil's way too good to let it be invaded by a major weed. So, not so fast. Get a plan for your giant Parramatta grass. So then if we go to the second soil test, what is it telling us now? You might have worked out now that if they're underlined, there's an issue there. So we've got acid soil at 4.7. We're going to be starting to have an effect on the nodules of legumes. We might still be able to grow white clover, but it won't nodulate that well. The aluminium saturation, 1.8, so that is low. It's not an issue for us. The sulfur is very low. Again, we want it to be over 8. The calcium-magnesium ratio is 1.1, so it's very low. You might start to think that dispersion could be an issue, but then you check out the sodium percent of cations and it's not an issue. So this shouldn't be an issue, but I'd still go out and do a field dispersion test to check that. The other factors are all fine for the environment. So soil test is telling us to spread lime because of the acidity and to add sulfur. But is this what we should do? Here's the landscape. We've got healthy native pasture. It's dominated by centred top. Now, centred top, for those who are not familiar, that's the red flowering that you see through here. Centred top is a highly sought out grazing species for beef cattle, and that's one of the reasons it's fairly hard to find a good stand of it now, because it gets grazed out of pastures. But the other really important thing here is using the natural cut, the cutting that someone's put in for a drain, and now we can see that we've got a soil depth that's not very deep. So the economic return of fixing just those couple of things, the native grass is not going to respond to lime, the native grass isn't going to respond to sulphur. If we decided to replace this pasture with something else, well, first of all, we'd probably come unstuck with some of our vegetation laws. But the second thing is that it's a shallow soil, so why replace something that's doing so well with something that may fail because of the depth of the soil? So don't mess with it. Now we get on to the third soil test. It's got acid soil, and look at this aluminium saturation, 53. That's just incredibly high. There are not many species that can cope with aluminium at that level. We've got a phosphorus coal well, even though the phosphorus buffering index is only 162, which for the coast is not that bad. Oh, well, it's actually pretty good for the coast. But less than 5, it's extremely low. We've got sulphur that's low, we've got potassium that's low. Other problems, we've got organic carbon that's 1.8, but in a way that's hardly surprising. With such a hostile soil, you're not going to get a lot of organic material growing, so not a great figure. But we also look at the calcium-magnesium ratio. It's one of the lowest I've ever seen, so it's very, very low. It's also sodic soil, so it's going to disperse. There's no issue with that, and certainly if we put a plough on it, we'd probably get quite a bit of erosion. So, and that cation exchange capacity of that, typical of a sandier sort of soil with low organic matter. So, should we spend a lot of money to fix this? That's a question I have been asked by paddocks with soil tests like that. But this is the paddock in question. It's dominated by wiregrass, wiry panic, and barbed wiregrass, all native species which obviously are pretty acid tolerant and aluminium tolerant. But even so, with that aluminium level, there's lots of bare patches in the paddock, and so it is struggling. We've also got trees indicating here. We've got spotted gum here, and we've also got ironbarks. In our area, in this area, the Macleay, the ironbarks and the spotted gum, shallow soil, tough conditions. So I'd say, no, don't spend any money on this paddock. I'd actually put a fence around it and allow these trees to take back over, because it's never going to be an economic return to investing in it, not with that shallow soil and those conditions there. So it's not worth fixing. Okay, so I've got another soil test for you. We've got pH of 4.1, very, very acid, but the aluminium is fine. It's not an issue. We've got phosphorus, even though it's 31, with a phosphorus buffering index of 800, it's not, it's low. So then we've got sulfate, sulfur, really, really high. We've got potassium, that's borderline. So we've got some issues going on. We've also got very poor calcium-magnesium ratio and an incredibly sodic situation. So the soil's definitely going to disperse in that. So after looking at our last one and all the problems and how expensive it's going to be to fix, should we lock up and forget this paddock? Well, once again, looking at the landscape can be very, very valuable before you make a judgment, because that's the landscape of that. It's a highly productive grazing wetland in the Macleay Valley. It's water couch is its dominant grass. Those of you familiar with the Macquarie marshes, the water couch is also out there, which makes it the valued grazing in their wetland areas. So it's also protecting acid sulfate soil from becoming more acid, but that's why there's so much sulphur, and that's why it's as acid as it is. We want it to stay wet, we want it to stay productive. So continue to rotationally and opportunity graze it, and no fertiliser is needed. It's a system that's looking after itself. So that's how soil tests can be informed by the landscape. But then there's another landscape out there. It's the economic and social landscape. We've got two properties here, one on this side. You can see it looks a bit greener. It's improved pastures. It's well fertilised. This side is naturalised pasture, a lot less fertiliser, a lot less input. They're on similar soil types, so why the difference? Well, it's simply that these guys, well, this property is owned by a Sydney-based family who have good incomes. They have a manager on the property and they invest a lot of money on their farm. This property is owned by a person who lives on the farm, whose kids are at boarding school. They don't have a lot of cash flow, so they're not investing a lot of money. So that is also in there. If you're giving advice about a soil test, think about there could be economic and social reasons that they are not doing what you advise, or why one course is better than another. I'm going to just touch on precision agriculture. There's a lot of big data coming in now. This is a yield map that I just grabbed from somewhere. I'm not going to explain it. But the big thing about it, you can see the greens and blues, they're the higher yields. The oranges are lower yield and the red is the lowest. These data sets are only as good as the calibration that is done for them. So you've got to go out there and ground truth any of these data sets that come in. I actually had a farmer telling us the other day on the cropping tour that he gets things like these yield maps and he looks at them, but he does nothing about them because he doesn't understand them. So that's a big gap we've got. We've got to get people understanding them, but we've also got to get them ground truthed, the calibrations right, so that the data we get from them is meaningful. And I'm just going to end up with the major limitation in our soil is moisture. If the rain doesn't come, it doesn't matter how well you fixed up the soil. But though a plant can last a lot longer if it's got deep roots that can access deeper moisture. And certainly if it keeps on raining regularly, a lot of the problems in a soil can be masked and forgiven. You just have to look at the yields that they get in England from regular rainfall compared to ours, even on better soils, just because of that moisture deficit that the plants have to go through and that stress. So my take-home messages are, soil tests are useful for making decisions, but it's just one tool. You've got to go out there and read the landscape. You go out there and do some physical tests. I always say to farmers, when they're putting in new fencing, when they put the holes down, have a look at the soil, see how it changes across the paddock. So you can check your paddock for indicated species. You can do those field tests. You can work out what you want and where you're starting from to work out if there is going to be an economic return for what you're doing. And then there are the social and economic barriers that you always need to take into account. But the baseline, though, is you work on your best paddocks first, because that's when you fix them, then you're going to get the best economic return. So finally, don't go racing around in circles. Go out and read your landscape and work out what your limitations are, both in the landscape, your soils, and with your farmers. Okay, thank you, Abby. That's the end.
Thank you very much, Carol. That was very thorough, and I think there's probably lots of really good points in there for everyone. So as I said at the beginning, I hope, if I remembered, is that we now have an opportunity to ask questions of Carol and also pass comment. And I will start with the questions here I have in the question pane. Donna Gamage has asked, do you find spotted gum in the Blue Mountains on sandstone?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer because I don't know the Blue Mountains enough.
Yeah.
But it could well be there. But some of those sandstones can be deep, but some of them can also be really shallow. So it's a bit of a hard question, that one. Go out and look for it. It looks like someone's hit it with a hammer.
Yeah, I also think perhaps, I'm not quite sure if they've done soil landscape mapping of that part of New South Wales, but the soil landscape maps that are produced by the Office of Environment and Heritage are a good way to start looking at landscapes, plant type indicators and soils rolled in to one, because that's how that soil landscaping process works. And you can look at hard copies of those in lots of council and university libraries, and there's also, it's online through their eSpade online device, so that's a good opportunity to look at that. Lynn Chapman has asked, she said, we need more soil test benchmarks for different areas, please. Would you like to comment on that, Carol?
We certainly do. There is, if you look at the Auscrop Nutrition Twitter handle, they have some links to some programs that there are some, especially in GRDC zones, that are out there now where you can put in your location and it will give you some of the benchmarks in cropping. But you're right, we need more benchmarks. And are they out there? They are, but they sometimes can be hard to access.
Okay, thank you. I'll go on to the next question, which is from Lisa Lobry de Bruin. She's asked if Landscan is run only through Tocal or other areas like LLS. So do you want to answer that?
Okay, so Landscan at the moment isn't run at all. There's very few presenters, trained presenters left. There are a few in local land services. It's a sort of thing that it's a 6 to 7 session course. It's still possible to run them, but usually people just use them and do the shorter soil stuff. But certainly there is the opportunity for the trainer for local land services if you guys want it, especially you guys from the LLS, so that you can take this sort of stuff on board. Yeah, so there's a 1-800 number on the Tocal website where you can talk to one of our coordinators, or you can go through the courses and see what's there. It's Landscan, certainly a course that we'd like to run again, but it's just, we have a low level of presenters left.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Kylie Kay has said that in one of the soil tests that you used, that lime and sulphur application wouldn't be the best option for a native grass paddock with poor root penetration. And she said, so her question is, what would be a good option to improve compacted soils or poor root growth?
It's not the best option because that's growing, and you can see it's growing really well. It's good ground cover. And in that situation, no application was the best thing because the root systems of those native grasses were doing that job itself. But so that was the one with the centre top being the main grass species. I wouldn't touch that. I would just very carefully put it into a rotational grazing program and allow the root systems and the organic matter that's coming from the material above to do it. I'd make it sure it was rotational because that centre top is sensitive to overgrazing.
Okay, thank you. I guess the other thing is that it depends if the compaction too is a natural feature or something that has resulted from other things like overstocking and things like that, and how easy it is to fix that.
Oh, with compaction, if it's a native pasture, then deep roofing is usually a risky thing to do with your native pasture because many of them don't like disturbance. I'd say the ability to let the root systems do their job, but you're not going to change the depth. That's a given. But the soil is put under the challenge, and it's not worth the economic return of spending a lot of money on it when it's growing decent grass as it is. The second one, which was on the very shallow soil with the high aluminium, that's just so challenged, it's not worth spending any money on it. The other one with the centre top, you could possibly think about oversowing a clover into it, but if you did that, you'd probably have to change the pH and change your grazing management.
And then the other thing too is that some of those compacted soils that's natural, and if they've got a high soil acidity, if you disturb them, you just open them wide up to erosion, which I think Carol mentioned.
Yes, you've got to be very careful, especially when they're sodic, is if you start opening them up, the water gets in, rips them out, and you end up with gullies instead of a paddock.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Andrew Walsh has asked if the courses that are run are generic or region-based. So can they be tailored to the northern tablelands, for example?
The answer is, I better not say yes because you asked two questions there. So now I'm a youth education trainer in agronomy and soils. I stay here in Tocal, but Harry Rose, who's the author of the grasses books, he does go around the state, and when he does them, he does personalise them to the area. So when we do paddock plants, for instance, you've got to use the plants that are growing in the paddock that you're using. So, and it talks about the indicators that are going on there. So if a course like that is run, then the local person finds a very interesting paddock with a bit of diversity. I remember I've done a few up in Armidale when Claire Edwards was the agronomist there, and I did them with her. And I remember these farmers being absolutely shocked that we found 20 species in 20 metres. And they were just stunned that they had that much diversity in their pasture. So
yeah,
yes, it's possible to run them and to personalise them.
Great, thank you. Kylie K has another question. Is there a way to improve water penetration on slopes, or is it more a case of working with that environment in terms of management and species?
No, there is definitely a way to improve water penetration on slopes, and that is to increase the infiltration of your soils. So the infiltration factors can be as simple as compaction. It could be as simple as putting swales in. Well, sorry, that's not simple. But it could be, the simplest one is improving the organic matter in the soil, which increases the ability of moisture to run in. So it's basically increasing the friability of your soil, and the easy way to do that is through organic matter. How do you get more organic matter? You either use a fertiliser with a lot of organic matter like chicken litter, or you just fix up deficiencies that are in the soil so the plants grow better, so there's better root systems. Now, some people are very keen on aerators for doing that, and they can work, but that disturbance can also introduce a factor which introduces a lot of weeds into the environment.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is from Ha-Hun, I hope I've got that name right, and they've said, could you recommend any papers or articles relevant to plant indicators applied for farming practices? Have you got any
Yep,
ideas?
I would recommend that you ring Harry Rose here at Tocal College, because he has them, and he hasn't got them published. He's got them on file on his computer for when he runs his courses.
Okay, and that's.
But Harry's a great botanist, and he does a lot on indicators.
And that 1-800 number that you talked about before, that would be the best number?
Yep, they can use that 1-800 number, and they'll put them through to Harry.
Donna Gamage has asked, what would applications of biochar or compost help with holding moisture in sandy soils or shallow soils?
Yes. So as long as you don't, I hope we haven't got any Western Australians online at the moment, because they have the sandy soils and are the experts at and trying to increase the moisture holding capacity, but they also have that water resistant sands that don't want to get
the
moisture
hydrophobic sand.
But that's the word, hydrophobic. But organic matter, so with the cation exchange capacity, that's made up, so that's what holds onto the cations. It's made up of the clay content and the organic matter content. So you can't change, except in Western Australia where they're doing it, you can't change your clay content without vast expense, but you can change your organic matter content. And so biochar is a pretty stable form of carbon. So, and when we're talking about organic matter, we are talking about the carbon. And any organic matter product can help your water holding capacity and your nutrient holding capacity.
Okay, thank you. And Lisa Lobry de Bruin has the last question that's on my list here, and she says, I know you're talking about soil, but what about ground cover alone in terms of an indicator if people are unaware or can't identify specific species?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. In the third soil test, we were looking at 53% aluminium. That's got very poor ground cover because of that soil restraint, not because of any grazing history or anything like that. And some people just say, oh, this grass, this wiry paddock is just rubbish. Look how poor the ground cover is. You go, well, no, it's there, and it's the only ground cover you got, and it's there because you've got, because it can cope with these conditions. With ground cover, it certainly can be an indicator that something is wrong. Now, you've got to, though, take a step backwards and say, this is ground cover that isn't because of someone's been overgrazing or any of those factors. This is ground cover. We've got a paddock here with a very poor ground cover area, and when you take a closer look, it's had sheet erosion, it's lost its topsoil, and that's why it's got ground erosion, that's why it's got poor ground cover, because it hasn't got the topsoil, so things can't get established in that zone. So areas that, if a paddock is all treated the same and you've got an area with poor ground cover, then that is an indicator that there is something happening in that area. Now, it could be that it's just a pest, like on the mid-north coast when we get Christmas beetle larvae in the ground at such vast numbers that they just take out everything, or armyworms can do the same thing, or spider mite. So you've got to take into account it could be a pest, but it's also, if it's there for quite a bit, it could easily be an issue. And I often recommend farmers in that situation, especially if it's a bigger area, is that they take a soil test from within the difficult zone, and then they take another soil test in the same paddock from an area they consider good, so that we can compare them. I did that with one farmer, and the difference between the two, it was a very sandy flat, and the difference between the two was the amount of carbon in the soil. That was the only thing that was different. And it was actually the reverse with him. He was comparing the really good area with the rest of the paddock, and it's actually where he burnt all the last lot of flood debris, and all that biochar had gone into the ground, had increased the carbon, the water holding capacity, and the nutrient holding capacity of that soil. He said he couldn't afford to put timber over the whole place though and burn it, but biochar could be an answer for him.
Thank you, Carol. I would also add to that look, biochar can be really hard to get hold of and very expensive, and often for both biochar and compost, the quantity of those things that you have to add to improve the organic carbon level of the soil
is
huge. So, the best way we say is to get something growing in there. That's the best way, and the best way to do that is
grow your own. Yeah. Fix your soil, grow your own.
That's right. And in answer to Lisa's question too, we have used ground cover, just a percent ground cover as a proxy for some soil health, and it is actually part of the Northern Rivers Soil Health Card that Carol mentioned at that. So that's a card with 10 indicators on it that farmers from a range of industries up here on the North Coast developed to assess the soil health, or their soil health, in addition to having a chemical soil test. So they did what Carol has just outlined. They looked at the soil test, they looked at the landscape, and they had this indicator test too. And so that card is able to be developed by any group that's interested for their area, because it should really be region specific, as much of this stuff that Carol's talked about should be. I might see if I might unmute Luke and see if he has a question. I think there was a question about indicators, Luke?
Yeah, that's right. Just wondering, Carol, how hard is it to ID your own indicators in your own area?
Well, one of the Abigail's already mentioned the soil landscape maps that are on the coast. They're very good, but it's a case of going out, and a lot of it's observation, and many of your farmers, some of you may be farmers, are very good at observation. And it's amazing how many times if I'm running a paddock plants course, I'll say, and this is an indicator of a wet area, and they'll go, oh yeah, I've noticed that. Wherever those tea tree grow, it's really wet. And you go, and it's also a sign of sodic soils. And they go, oh, is that why if you pull it out, it erodes so easily? And so they often have already made these observations, and it's about finding them out for them. So it's like you talk to a farmer in the Central West, and they'll say, oh, the country that grows Currajong is the best country. Unfortunately, there's less and less Currajongs out there, but so you can go out there, and the people who are working the land already have a lot of these indicators. They just haven't put two and two together to say, oh, I know this, but I haven't thought of it as being an indicator. So it is possible. And when I first went to the Mid-North Coast, I got in contact with the amateur botanists in the area. I also talked to a lot of farmers about indicators, and I also found a couple of people who are really interested in soils, and I quizzed them about the local area and what was indicators. And I had several people say, oh, get in the car, we'll go and have a look. I'm going to show you this with a landscape, and I'll show you this sodic soil over here. And so I developed my own. It is possible. It's just basically harvesting the knowledge that's already out there.
Yeah, that's good advice. Okay, well, that appears to be all the questions we have. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Carol again for presenting this November webinar, and also all of you for attending and supporting the SNOC community of interest. And hope to see you next month for our last webinar of the year with Tim Weaver, and look out for your invitation for that. If you're a subscriber, if you're not a subscriber, subscribe and then you'll get the invitation. So thank you very much, Carol.
My pleasure.